This is the second of our studies on marriage, and we've called this one Paradise Lost. In the first study, we saw that the very heart of relationships comes from our God, who is a relational God. Everything about him is about relationships. We saw the way that males and females were created for marriage in the same way that God is in his very nature. In this study, we look at what people call the fall, the time when sin entered the world and when really relationships went wrong. In a way, you could call this study the fall of marriage. As a pastor, I'm someone who does marriage counselling with people. And as I do this marriage counselling, I find this Genesis 3 very helpful because it tells us of the real situation that we're in today, the places where we fail in relationships. So I hope you enjoy this study.
Genesis 3, the opening of it, gives us a very beautiful picture of harmony between human beings and God, human beings and one another, and with the creation itself. And it says there that God wanted to walk with Adam in the garden in the cool of the day. I remember a friend of mine in a Bible study once said this puzzled him. Why did it say that? God wanted to walk in the garden with Adam in the cool of the day. One day it hit him like a ton of bricks. He said, man, that's because that's what God most wants to do, to walk with us in the garden, sharing all the riches of creation in that intimate kind of friendship with God. That's where life flourishes. Get with God. That's where we'll know that.
At the fall, we see all of the problems that come into a relationship, the relationship between Adam and Eve, but then they spread to all other relationships of those who come from Adam and Eve. I've heard it said that the fall was a problem for Adam and Eve because they covered themselves up with fig leaves, and of course when fall comes, we know that the leaves, they fall, don't they? But that's not really what the fall's about. At the fall, relationships were destroyed in a sense through pride and selfishness and rebellion and the desire to be Lord of all. And we're going to look at those things separately in this study.
The fall has affected every human relationship, whether you're married or unmarried. Being made in the image of God means we're made for relationships. The fall meant that our focus now basically just came to ourselves. And so rather than being there for the other, we're there for ourselves.
Friendships that I have with people are really affected when I'm a bit selfish. Sometimes they do things and I go, I don't want to do something for you now, or I want to do this for me, and then they get upset and it doesn't really help. And then I feel worse, and then our friendship is a bit from here to here, it's a bit crappy.
You always have to be in charge of what's going on and what's happening and whatever you're doing.
So society really expects you to have this kind of high self-esteem, very confident, and be like prideful almost, which is not always a good thing. Kind of can affect your relationships pretty badly.
Makes it harder to say sorry, eh?
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry too. Selfishness can do that a bit too though. Like, if you don't want to do something, or if you want to keep something to yourself, then your friendships can be a bit downward.
And every time somebody tells you what to do, you always want to go against what they say, and sometimes you do without thinking, even though it's not right.
It sort of seems like pride and selfishness and rebellion, like they affect everything in relationships or friendships and everything.
Is that why Pride and Prejudice is such a long book?
But the serpent said to the woman, "You will surely not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Sometimes professional people work pro bono, which means for the public good. And this was the way that the serpent presented himself. He never said to Eve, look, come on and I'll show you how to do something really bad, really evil. He actually presented something to her that theologians call sub specie boni, which means some aspect of goodness. And so what he had for Eve was a really good idea. You won't die, but it'll actually help you to be like God and know good and evil. He was offering to Eve a step up. And so Eve got the hang of this, and she saw that the fruit was good to taste, and that it was pleasing to the eyes, and that it would have a good effect. And so she took from it. In this way, we see how human beings gild the lily in order to get around God's commandments.
One of our problems in modern society is that we have this belief that we are God, that we are the ones who define what is good and what is evil. And so we want to redefine marriage as if it was something we created instead of a wonderful gift that had been given to us by God.
So this pride brings us first and foremost into a conflict with God, and then immediately we're butting heads against each other. If I know what's good and what's evil, and my wife knows what's good and what's evil, then what happens when we have a disagreement? Who is the ultimate authority in all of this? Each of us is going to think that we know what's best.
I remember when on our wedding day, one of the lessons was one of the piece of advice I was given by my mom is that Susan is always right. Susan will always be right. And honestly, I'm a doctor, Susan's a lawyer, so I know a lot, I thought. And I know what's right, and it's you always get that feeling that I know what it is, and it causes quite a bit of tension because I know what's right and what Susan knows is wrong, and it's a really difficult thing to be able to just step back and actually look at it openly and takes a lot of hard work to take that pride, swallow that pride, and I can say a lot of prayer. And you do, because my driving's really, really good. Well, can you tell me about that? And every time you're told, but you've got to just step back and actually say, actually, yes, dear, you have a point. And that's the other lesson. You want to have the last word in the argument? Yes, dear.
It's really hard to give in, especially when you think that you're right, and women are usually quite right. But seriously, I think it's a lot of pride, and whenever you think things through, when you have prayed about it, you always see how big actually your pride is. And a lot of times it's not even the really big things that we have conflict about. It's like everyday things. I mean, it could even be just how we raise our kids. And sometimes you might really feel, especially as a mother, that you really know a lot about what's right for the children. And like for me, when Ken's away a lot, and so sometimes I might even resent the fact that he thinks he knows what's right. But, in the end, I have to sort of calm down and think things through his way. I mean, the best thing that has helped us is that we are able to sort of talk about things after we've cooled down a bit and pray through things, and that's helped. But conflict is always there. It's there with the kids. It's there all around us, because everybody actually loves to be right and nobody wants to be wrong.
We read on in Genesis 3, the man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit from the tree, and I ate." Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" The woman said, "The serpent tricked me, and I ate." So all the harmony that was there at the opening of chapter 3 is just bangs, gone in an instant. And we notice now that concern has turned from the other to self. It's all out now for number one. There's no loving and caring for the other. It's about number one and defending ourselves, justifying ourselves. So there we say, I didn't do it, he did it. It's not my fault, it's her fault. And they're accusing each other like crazy. And I guess that's probably quite familiar to all of us who are in marriage relationships.
So in essence, what Adam was saying to Eve was something along the lines of, I know you have some good points, but that's why I married you. But in the end of the day, you're the one that's to blame for our problems. So, it's kind of the attitude we get, isn't it? It's not my fault. We're so convinced of this when we go about our daily lives. It gets very destructive, that whole me right, you wrong sort of mentality. But when we stop and think about it, what is the reality of this? We know that in the end, we're both wrong. And in the story of Adam and Eve, both had rebelled against, the God of all love.
After sin, marriage always means the coming together of two people who think that they are right, but are usually always wrong. Adam, when he had to face God after he knew he had done wrong, knew that he would face what I call the have you question. In families, we have lots of have you questions. Have you put out the garbage, dear? Or have you measured, have you repaired that tap that was leaking? Have you kids tidied your rooms? There's always have you questions. And Adam knew that he was in for the biggest have you of them all. Have you eaten of the tree I commanded you not to eat? So he had his defense to show that he was in the right. And he simply said, look, God, I'm just an honest battler. Don't blame me. I got to tell you, it's hard to soar with the eagles when you work with a bunch of turkeys like you and Eve. We know with this self-justifying pride that marriage is not going to be easy. There will always be a tendency to say, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, when in fact we are.
There's a sense in which for us marriage is an impossible ideal because every marriage is a union of two sinners. So they will sin against each other. They will fail each other all the time. In our society, the main reason given for divorce is incompatibility. But because we're sinners, there's always going to be an incompatibility. There will never be perfection. But nevertheless, despite those difficulties and impossibilities, God still blesses marriage and he keeps it and he protects it and he enables it to work in impossible circumstances.
Well, today, we probably all remember the reality show of The Farmer Wants a Wife, and they put so much effort into try and find people that are compatible with one another. But personally, I've found with marriage, it's not necessarily all about compatibility. It is learning to live with each other's incompatibility in the sense that to make life interesting. And I'm certainly not compatible with Rita when it comes to gardening. And, and she's not compatible with me with a few things, I guess. But we share our interest with one another. And I support her in her gardening, even though I don't do much physical work toward it. But I encourage her with her interest. So incompatibility don't necessarily affect a marriage. It can enhance a marriage. And I think we've overcome our incompatibilities. And even if we looked at our blood type, it wasn't compatible for having children. So the doctors have to be very careful after each child of ours was born that they may need a blood transfusion or whatever. But that didn't make a difference with our relationship or didn't affect our family at all. So it's, Rita, I want to have something to say about that for sure.
Yeah. Oh, well. Yes, Ross has got other interests, as he said. He likes his computer and council and meetings, and where I'm not all that keen on that. And I have do art and things like that, what I enjoy, and we just have each other's space whenever needed. And yeah, so I really don't know what else to say about
Well,
that.
well, I guess we do look forward to coming together every now and again, sharing
yes,
those
definitely.
interests. And Rita gives me a lot of support in what I do as well, and comes to me for to celebrations and so forth, and we share so much of that. And so in effect, we share each other's interests.
Sure. Of course, being complementary is not the same as being the same, because you and I are different.
We are. And in fact, before we got married, my mother-in-law said that was one of the great advantages she saw in our upcoming marriage, in that we have complementary gifts and that we add to each other.
There are things that you're good at that I'm not good at, and vice versa.
For example, if there are difficult pastoral care situations,
I send you.
That's right.
Because you're more tactful than me.
You'll send me.
And you fix the taps.
Yes, and we add to each other. And that's very helpful for a successful marriage.
It is.
The struggle for power in marriage relationships actually happened right at the beginning, right at the fall. Adam and Eve were both involved in the first sin, and it wasn't so much that they now had a problem with God. Ultimately, it meant that they had a problem with each other. That was part of the curse of the fall of that first sin. We see the curse that is given to Eve by the Lord in chapter 3 of Genesis from verse 16. He says, "Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." Sometimes we can read a passage like that completely out of context and think that this is referring to the fact that Eve will desire her husband in a loving relationship. But it's really not what the passage is saying at all. We need to remember this is actually part of the curse. And what the Lord is actually saying, as a result of the fall, of going after their own power, Eve is now going to desire the power of her husband, but she is going to be frustrated because her husband will rule over her. And so we have the relationship which is once of oneness and service, now ultimately being about self-service and trying to find power. And that relationship is actually really torn apart at the fall. We see the same word actually used in relationship to Cain and Abel. Cain is very angry because the Lord has not accepted his offering. And the Lord speaks to Cain in chapter 4 of Genesis, in verse 6, saying, "But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it." So it's the same phrase which is actually being used with Adam and Eve here, saying that sin is crouching at your door and it desires to have what you have. And so the Lord is actually saying to Eve, because of the result of the fall, you're going to desire to have what Adam has, which is the authority to rule and to be the head in the relationship. And that means that relationship is essentially torn apart.
Part of the fallout of the fall is that there is this deep power struggle between husband and wife. Each will have a kind of hankering to want to get the upper hand over the other. And husband and wife, I think a lot of the time, subconsciously will use whatever there is at their disposal in their relationship, their strength, might be logical argument, might be manipulation, can be sexuality. Use all of these things and to try and manipulate and get the upper hand. I think usually this power struggle is never too far away from any marital conflict that comes up.
I have a very beautiful wife. She's very wise, comes up with some really great ideas. But the reality is really I know that I'm the boss. And there might be a dispute that we have that means that she somehow is just trying to maybe take the steering wheel. But really, I know what's right. And I'm the one that really should be taking lead in this particular situation. The problem is she also thinks that she's the boss as well, and therefore we have all sorts of trouble with that.
So both want to rule over each other, and both want to rule over God. There's this great authority tussle that comes in relationships, and it greatly affects the way that they relate to each other and the way they relate to God.
There's always, I guess, in a relationship, some desire to have your own way and to
make the other person do what you want them to do. And it's all sorts of different things. It can be how you like the toilet roll hung up. I mean, that's pretty stupid, really, isn't it? But there's all sorts of things where, it wasn't until I read that passage and had explained to me what the full meaning of it. I thought, oh yeah, that happens all the time. I do that all the time. That I actually laud it, and I guess you might have some reflections on that too. I'm not going to tell you what you think.
I think as you're married longer, as you get older, you get a bit more set in your ways. You have to always struggle with that. When you're tired and busy, you get busier as you get older, and you get your teenage kids, and you need to be in about 10 places at once, and then it's a lot easier to be irritable, and you just have to keep working on that, trying not to be too grumpy at each other and too irritated when you're tired. And when the really romantic feeling of love sort of lessens, it's a little harder. The rubber hits the road some days.
Yeah, I think too, though, that as you get, I don't know, I think that because we were married, we were quite young, we were both, Tanya was 20, I was 21, that, although we become set in our ways, I think often our ways actually, the way that I like my household now is far more similar to what Tanya likes than what my household I grew up in. And that's a huge advantage, I think, is that, even my workshop, which is not tidy, is a lot tidier than it would have been, compared to what my father had. So I think you sharpen each other, I guess the Bible says iron sharpens iron. And you actually have that influence on each other. But there's still that contention, whether it's how you spend money or what you do with your holidays or all those things.
When you want your husband's haircut.
I think it looks fine, personally.
One of the things I really love about the Bible and the gospel is that it is so real and down to earth and human. If we read Genesis 3 and how it describes the realities, the cold, hard realities of living out a relationship, it's very realistic, talks about the pain and the struggles and the difficulties that we have. A lot of time these days, young people get this kind of sickly, romantic idea of what marriage will be, a sort of fairy tale image. And it's very unrealistic and sets young people up for a lot of disappointment and actually failure. Whereas the gospel addresses the real situation in life, the real things that we struggle with. We need to be able to accept that. It's not that marriage isn't still the best relationship that there is. It is, and the Bible celebrates that. But it acknowledges the realities we struggle with as well.
Okay. So through the fall, we can see there's a great damage that's been done to relationships, and we might ask the question, well, is there any hope then for relationships? Can marriage survive? Can anybody survive such a great assault on true and pure relationships? Every marriage relationship has two sinners in it, and that's a great problem. We see as Christians the answer to the problems of the fall and of sin comes through Jesus, God's Son, and that through his death he brought a reconciliation when he took the punishment due for our sin in relationships. He brought a reconciliation between us and the Father. And if there's a reconciliation between us and the Father, then there can be a reconciliation between human beings and human beings, or more particularly between husband and wife. And so they can actually live in this fullness in a relationship. There can be a forgiveness and a humility come to broken relationships, and it comes through Jesus Christ.
Because Jesus has joined us to God in the cross and in his resurrection, we can be joined to each other in our human relationships as well. We're going to find one answer or one antidote to the fall and the severed relationship we have with God. It's the cross. It's God coming in our place in Jesus Christ and dealing with the mess of our sin, our guilt, dealing with our shame and our brokenness. And a wonderful reality of that is that when we come to receive God's love in that way, we recognise we don't actually need to hold on to power anymore. because we've been given everything in Christ, and therefore we can be more about serving and loving rather than self-protection.
We can all remember times when, as children, we wanted to know what was inside the presents under the wrapping. And so perhaps we snuck in to those presents under the Christmas tree, or the one in the cupboard for our birthday, and we just carefully lifted the sticky tape and looked at the end of the box. And then we tried to put the sticky tape back down, but unfortunately it never sticks as well after you've lifted it. And the reason is that some of the paper material on which it was stuck has bonded to the sticky. And that impurity impedes any subsequent bonding. In our relationships, guilt is the impurity which affects the bonding of our relationships. And it is that impurity of guilt that Jesus has dealt with in his forgiveness through the cross. And so the beautiful thing is we are restored in purity and can then enter fully into the bonding of all our love relationships.
But marriage still works, doesn't it, Graham?
Yes, it does. Because of Christ's death and Christ's resurrection, we have hope, and therefore marriage works.
Jesus showed us by his selflessness and his sacrifice he set us a very good example in how we should relate to each other.
He did, and because we are all sinners, but because of what Jesus has done, we can all be saved. We can all be saints. We may be fallible as humans, but through Jesus, marriage works.
It does, and because when I think about all the times I've sinned against God and all the things I've done wrong and what he's forgiven me for, and then I think of the little things that you've done against me and the little things that I've done against you, they really don't seem very significant. And it would be very foolish for us to bear grudges against one another, wouldn't it?